Welcome to Pure Intuitive Talk with me, Trish Smith. I'm a multi-dimensional channeler sharing my gift to assist others to connect and work with their whole being, helping bring them into a beautiful way of high-frequency living. Immerse yourself in an hour of nourishment that feeds your spiritual journey and invites you to embrace your empowered soul. You'll feel armed with new understandings for how to shift from pain to love as we explore topics from shamanic sound healing to gut health. Are you ready to take accountability for the impact that we have on the world around us and learn new tools and techniques to feel whole again? Of course you are, and you're in the right place. Pure Intuitive Talk starts now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Pure Intuitive Talk. I'm your host, Trish Smith. Right now, you're tuned into Transformation Talk Radio, or maybe you're tuned into YouTube. I don't know which channel you're listening on, but thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here. Today, I'm going to delve into a subject that feels super taboo right now in our culture, and that is of family estrangement. If you yourself have not had experience with this, I am very happy for you because myself personally, I have, and most people I know either have themselves or are very close to someone who is. And so I wanted to be able to provide my insights, provide my opinion, and some of the ways that I'm using in my own life to help navigate these times, in hopes that I'm able to offer you as a listener maybe a tool, maybe an aha moment, right? Maybe something that I say triggers a revelation inside of yourself, and then you can take that information and share it with your people, right? I was teaching a class the other night, and I was saying the best thing that we can do is share what we know that's helping us with others, right? So this is me simply sharing what I've witnessed, sharing information that I've gathered, and sharing my own experiences in hopes of helping you help yourself, and helping me help myself, and helping our loved ones. So here it goes. I'm going to do my best to stay calm with a subject that is very emotionally charging for me personally. I am in an estranged relationship. I don't know if that would be the correct terminology with my own parents. And so those circumstances were beyond my control. I am the one that would like to have a relationship, and I tend to be that person in most of my relationships throughout my life. I know that some of us are wired to more easily cut people out of our lives, and some of us are wired more to hold on. So I know it seems to me like maybe 50% of the people that I know have more of a detached personality where they're like, whatever, it's on them. And then the other people I know, myself personally, like I'll take things more personally. I'll want resolution. I'll want connection. And so it seems like we come up against each other sometimes with those different personality traits. But I want to be able to shed some light on this subject because it seems like most people aren't talking about it, and it's truly very, very, very sad to be witnessing an epidemic like this. My personal theory and opinion is that a lot of it is stemming from the shutdowns that we experienced 5 years ago. So yes, I can attest to there is a political divide. Yes, I see that as humans, especially in our melting pot that we call America, we have managed to divide ourselves by religion and gender and race and all of those other ways that we've either been programmed to divide ourselves, or we've allowed ourselves to divide ourselves from others because of those things, right? So absolutely, there's a huge political divide right now. It's unfortunate. I do believe that our relationships should be able to last for decades, if not a lifetime, when we tend to them. And sadly, we've witnessed a lot of people walk away from relationships that have either been long-standing or have not even been willing to have a relationship with people that they meet and maybe they enjoy once they find out, what their political views are. Remember back in the day, they used to say, "Oh, we don't talk about religion, we don't talk about politics," right? And at this point in our time in history, we're like, "Yeah, I get it. Like, I can see why we used to say that." So I agree with both sides of that. I want us to be able to have conversations. I think we should be able to talk about religion and spirituality, and we should be able to talk about our political views. And bottom line is we should be doing that respectfully, right? However, some people are not having those conversations respectfully, and I can appreciate that sometimes relationships become divided, not become because of somebody's political views, but because of their behaviors that are stemming from their political views. And so I think that's where people need to be careful when it comes to explaining why they've decided not to have somebody in their life, right? Is it because they support one party or the other? Or is it because every single time they come around you, they're shoving it down your throat, right? Or is it because you're like, they're consumed by it and it's hard for me to spend my time with a person that's all that they talk about because they're obsessing over it. So I think it's important to just be able to discern that. And if we do find someone that's consumed by political views, that maybe we can offer space for that. My theory, here we go, is that 5 years ago, we experienced these global shutdowns, right? We had reason to have some valid fear. And then we were also, in addition to that, programmed to be afraid. There are a lot of people that locked themselves inside, stayed away from people. They really succumbed to those fears, and that's traumatic, right? So they experienced a very traumatic event, and it takes time to navigate our way back to mental health after experiencing mental illness, right? So for those of us, everybody, right, who has experienced significant loss, right, and we've gone through a grieving period, or we've suffered significant trauma, and we've gone through a period of post-traumatic stress, for most people, those times will shift, they will lighten, and we come out of it finding ourselves becoming more and more mentally healthy again, right? However, some of us end up with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So our brain chemistry has changed enough that it's actually altered our brain chemistry for years, for years and years, if not for the rest of our lives. Myself, I am somebody that was diagnosed with PTSD. My brain map shows my PTSD in there. I've done tons of work trying to resolve that within my brain. The things that we do are not changing my brain map. My brain map still shows that there's PTSD in my brain, right? And so that's where I like to differentiate between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. Everybody typically experiences post-traumatic stress from an event, but doesn't necessarily end up with post-traumatic stress disorder, in my opinion. And so there are people out there that are having post-traumatic stress disorder from those shutdowns and from the level of fear that they were experiencing. And so what I feel like I'm witnessing is that people, rather than finding the courage within to navigate those fears, and maybe some people are doing it in small ways, right? However, some people are protecting their fears, right? So if you're afraid to have a conversation with someone, but you haven't recognized that you're afraid to have a conversation with someone, the easy button may be don't have the conversation at all, right? And so I believe that's what's leading people towards cutting others off. I believe that it's actually a fear. And then there's that protective mechanism that comes in as the human right to protect that fear, right? We want to nurture that fear, keep that fear alive. Just kidding. But anyways, what happens when we do that is we don't grow, right? So we're not growing our capacity to be able to handle the things that we were either once able to handle before the event, or things that we've never even experienced before, right? Handle new challenges. So anyways, we've got a couple of minutes before we go to break, but I want to, when we get back, talk about the statistics and what it's looking like out there in the United States as far as family estrangement is concerned, and specifically adult children cutting their parents off. So we'll go ahead and go to our break, maybe let a couple of those things resonate that I mentioned. And when we get back, we'll dive into more specific relationships that have been suffering the consequences of people protecting their fears. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Trish Smith. I'm the host of Pure Intuitive Talk. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Pure Intuitive Talk. I'm your host, Trish Smith, and today we are going over the topic of family estrangement. Because I have personal experience with this, it's actually a very difficult subject for me to touch on. However, I felt like it was a really important subject because I would say probably at least 30 to 40% of the people I know are experiencing this family estrangement with their children. And if they haven't been cut off, the children are definitely keeping that at an arm's length. And I'm talking about adult children, obviously, and I should not refer to them as children because they are in fact adults. And they are navigating times that they were not prepared to navigate, and simply put, neither were we, right? So 5 years ago, the world shut down, right? That caused a traumatic lifestyle, right? Not only did we have a traumatic event, right? So you have a traumatic event, that event, maybe like a car accident, it's actually a short-lived period of time of the event itself, but then sometimes the post-traumatic stress can last for days, weeks, months, and then sometimes you end up in post-traumatic stress disorder, which can last for years or a lifetime, right? Now, the shutdowns in 2020 were not a traumatic event that was short-lived, that went on for months and into, more than a year, right? So that being said, I believe that we need to have compassion for each other, especially when it comes to these generational differences. Now I'll have to throw in there too at some point. I'll save that for the next segment. An interesting fact that I learned when doing a little research on the topic, about I'll throw it out there for a second about white people. It was talking about how this is affecting white people more so than other ethnicities, right? And I have my theories behind that as well. But I want to get back to talking about the generational divide, right? And so what we're witnessing right now, and what I've noticed is that my generation, right? So I'm Gen X, I'm a Gen Xer, and we were raised by people that had been raised by people that had been without. They had, for generations before us, at some of those generations, there was war on our soil. Some of those generations were drafted into wars that they didn't want to go serve in, right? Veterans coming back with PTSD, sadly, raising their children with PTSD and not having an explanation for it. And so there was a lot of anger. And in my opinion, what it looks like to me, observing the collective, is that we went from thousands of years, right? Generation by generation by generation, the power lying in the parents' hands. And so as a Gen Xer who was raised being afraid of their father, everybody that we knew when we were growing up was afraid of their father, right? That's how we were raised. And the children were disciplined. And I can, speak for my family, and I cannot speak for anybody else's family. But when I was growing up, yes, we were spanked. Yes, we were disciplined. I was not abused physically. I remember studying abuse in high school and going, oh, okay, so I've been verbally abused. But back then, I really felt like most kids were, most parents were verbally abusive, and they'd come from long lines of being not only verbally abused but physically abused, right? And people have suffered sexual abuse in their families. And so I personally feel like I had a pretty normal childhood for that place and time, right? I was born in 77, and at that time, the dads were the disciplinarian for the most part, and they spanked you. And obviously, there was many families where that crossed the line into physical abuse, right? And they were not said, oh, hey, like for me, it was like, you're going to get a spanking. And I don't look back and feel like my dad physically abused me because he spanked me. I feel like that was how he had been raised to discipline and what they believed was the right thing to do. And so I personally don't hold that against him. And I suppose as an adult who has adult children, that I am hoping for the same grace and compassion from my children. In that when my generation, Gen X, were raising our children, we had been raised to be afraid of our fathers, right? And so while we were raising our children, we were trying to do it differently. I know for myself and my husband, we kind of had a discussion. Actually, the kids were really little, and we said, we don't want our kids to grow up being afraid of their father, you know? And so I believe that most of us in our generation tried to raise our kids a little differently. And I don't want to discredit my parents' generation, because in my family line, I've personally witnessed each generation breaking cycles. I really, really have. And I believe that's true for a lot of us. So some of the times I see out there people saying, oh, you're the one breaking these generational curses for your whole family line. Let's give credit where credit is due, man. The people that have come before us, they've been doing their work for the most part too. There's definitely people that carry on traditions of abuse in their family, but I think the majority of people really try to break the chains. The problem is there's so many to break, and then there's new chains being added while we're trying to break the old ones, right? How do you even keep up with it? But I noticed this shift in power, right? So while Gen Xers were raising their children to not be afraid of them, there was this huge power shift, right? And the power shifted over to the child, and the child does not carry the wisdom of the adult, right? And so I believe that it's a time right now where that's all being sorted out. Now, I don't agree with the cutting off a parent unless, of course, it's an abusive relationship. But I can appreciate that the children of this generation, I feel bad calling them children, they're young adults. Anyways, the young adults, the Gen Zers, right, that they are coming into their own. They don't want to tolerate some of these old-fashioned behaviors that we still have yet to get out of our own conditioning. But at the same time, in my opinion, they are not being handed the right tools. My personal opinion, from what I've witnessed and what I've experienced, in my own family and among my friends and their families, is that some of this pop psychology of letting people go, turning people away, everybody's toxic, right? In my opinion, it's a bit of an entitled attitude, right? When we've decided as a person that people are toxic, when in fact they're not, right? So I believe that it would be important to define toxic, right? Because somebody not agreeing with you does not make them toxic. Now, somebody that is abusive, right, and continually carries on these cycles of negativity and maybe putting you down, talking down to you, those kinds of things, yes, I can appreciate, like, I need distance from that person. And I would personally say that cutting someone out of your life should be a last resort. But of course, when there's abuse involved, the most healthy thing you can do is to cut them out of your life. I can appreciate that. However, I think there should be a lot more people willing to have conversations before they cut people out of their lives, rather than taking the easy button and just cutting them out, not giving the other person the opportunity to explain themselves, not giving the person the opportunity to correct their behavior, right? So I'm wondering, right? I know a lot of young people have gone to therapists, and therapists, in my opinion, sometimes are maybe stroking the ego of these young people. When you go into therapy, right, it's the therapist is listening to one view. You go to a counselor, you go to a therapist, and you explain to them what's going on. Now, hopefully this therapist or counselor, psychologist has enough discernment that they can recognize when a young adult is playing the victim, right? When everything keeps happening to them. And so I feel like sometimes, are these people stroking the ego of these young adults rather than teaching them discernment and having them look at the other person in their life as a human being, and helping them develop compassion for that person who is, more often than not nowadays, their parent, right? And that can be dangerous, right? Because now we are witnessing families be divided. And in my opinion, families should be able to be the ones that you can fall back on, right? And so if we're severing our relationships with them, what happens when we need that person to fall back on, right? Hopefully the people that have cut their families off are able to find that in the world. But you've got to remember, we're experiencing, more and more higher and higher suicide rates, right? So are they finding that? Are they cutting their parents out of their lives and finding a true support system? Or are they cutting their parents out of their lives and then sadly becoming more and more lonely and confused and protecting the fear to the degree that the fear consumes them? And then they start having anxiety thoughts and trusting those anxiety thoughts and intrusive thoughts, rather than being able to find that place of love and compassion within themselves that will speak life into their own body, mind, and spirit. So I know that's a lot to process, but the statistics are very sad. 26 of young adults are estranged from their fathers, while 6% are estranged from their mothers. That's a huge number. And I would like to encourage, if you're a listener and you're a young adult, a Gen Zer, encourage you to take into consideration how your parents were raised, how they were programmed, and be willing to find the place within yourself to offer grace for that. And then if you're the parent, right, of a young adult who is wanting to cut you off or is cutting you off, having compassion for the position that they're in as a young adult living in the culture that we live in right now, because it's not easy. It's emotionally draining at times to navigate all of the emotional things that are happening between social media, that we keep getting, information inundated, and trying to work full time and run a home and all of the things, right? It's just very overwhelming to be alive in these times. So we'll go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, I wanted to talk about our role in this epidemic, our role as the parent, as the adult, as the wisdom keeper, right? So you're tuned into Pure Intuitive Talk right now. I'm your host, Trish Smith. When we get back, we'll talk more on this taboo subject, but for now, we'll go ahead and take a break. everybody. Welcome back. I'm Trish Smith, your host of Pure Intuitive Talk. And before we went to the break, we were talking about this epidemic that's happening. And we call it an epidemic because millions of families are being impacted by this right now. Statistics are really high. It's very sad. There is a point in time, I believe, maybe where it was maybe beginning, right? But a lot of people that I spoke to in the general public, when you're out buying groceries or whatever, and apparently I have that thing, that thing where you're out in public and people download their life story to you. I have that. So, so when I would go out in public, a lot of women would kind of dump their stories onto me. And at that time, a lot of the stories were, I don't even know what's happening. My daughter is cutting me out of her life. I don't even know what I did. I've tried so hard to be a great parent. And over and over and over again, that's what was coming in, right? Clients in my office, social media posts, all of it, right? All the information coming in was what's happening here, right? People felt lost, confused, blindsided, right? And so for myself in my own mind, it makes sense, right? When an adult child cuts off their parent because their parent was abusive, their parent was actually toxic. But yeah, trying to wrap my head and their heads around being cut off when they had spent a couple of decades intentionally trying to be the best parent that they could be, and not understanding why their parent or their child is now viewing them as the enemy. It was so overwhelming, and it still is for so many people. Now, my brain, I don't know if it's the ADHD or whatever's going on in there, but my brain picks up patterns, right? And it connects the dots. And what I noticed is the language among the young adults, the Gen Z generation, it's literally like verbatim, word for word, often when I'm hearing stories from different people talking about their niece, their child, their nephew, their friend's kid, whatever. It's literally the same language, right? And so my brain has developed the theory that it's the programming, right? So I have seen a lot of social media posts over the last few years or so that have really been so divisive. And I've talked about them in other episodes where it's like, oh, shut everybody out of your life, oh, you're so negative, we can't be around you. And I've talked about that where it's like, okay, well, what happens when you're going through your hell in your life, right? I remember when my kids were growing up, I trained them to see that when people are, typically, not all the time, but typically when people are being nasty and they seem miserable, there's a root cause for that, right? And I remember my children had a teacher in middle school who was pretty miserable, right? And she made sure that, she made other people's lives miserable too, right? And I have plenty of information that points to that being true, unfortunately. And I just remember explaining to my kids, like, you don't know what happened and why this teacher is as miserable as she is, but offer her grace. And so I just kind of trained my children to be able to look at people and say, oh, I don't know what the reason is, but there's probably a good reason under there why they're so unhappy. Does that make their behavior okay? No, it doesn't excuse the behavior. If it's your teacher who's yelling at all the kids all the time, absolutely, it does not excuse the behavior. But, being willing to look at it, so that you can either offer grace or not take it personally, or both. So our role in this epidemic is similar to how I train my children to be able to look at the other and understand that they too are suffering. And again, does not excuse poor behavior. But when I personally, as a Gen Xer, look at Gen Zers and remind myself that a lot of these adult children went through high school years where they weren't able to go to school, right? Some of them missed out on the normal things that people got to experience their senior years. And then with all of those shutdowns, that was very traumatic, right? And they're still navigating how to come out of that, right? A lot of them, you talk to the youth, they've got a lot of anxiety, and they're experiencing anxiety and depression. And oftentimes they don't even have the tools to manage that. And they were very young. That's a very impressionable time in our lives, and they experienced a global shutdown. Those of us that were in our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s experiencing a global shutdown, it was like, okay, here we go, right? And we were more capable because our capacity had been stretched because we'd been alive longer, more decades than they had. And we've had enough life experience that we have that inner strength to be able to manage those kinds of conditions. They, however, were not at an age where they had been stretched and their capacity had been grown so that they had the tools and the capacity to navigate those things. So I believe that our role as a Gen Xer and above, right, is to remind ourselves that we need to be able to have compassion for their generation and recognize that they don't know what they're doing, right? So when, let's say, well, for best example I can come up with that came to me, sorry. I was in the California Conservation Corps when I was 19, and I was a chainsaw specialist, right? And so I had to learn how to take the chainsaw part, put it back together, name every part on it, right? So while I was learning how to do that, I was stumbling through it, right? It's a learning curve. And but as I practiced and practiced and practiced and learned and learned and learned and taught myself, I got better and better and better at it, right? So I believe that we should offer Gen Zers the grace and compassion for them learning to develop the kinds of skills that they would need in order to navigate those times during those times, right? So for us, if we are modeling for them what that looks like, we have a much higher chance of them finding their way back to us and finding their way back to trusting us. They learned at that time, right? What was programmed with fear is that you can trust no one, right? That's what fear says. Fear says the opposite of trust, right? I can't trust these people. And at the time it was, I can't trust anybody, they're going to get me sick, right? But that fear, when it installs itself into our mindset, it's an infection, right? And it starts infiltrating other thought processes and other areas of our lives, sometimes whether we want it to or not, right? There are places where fear is important and we should be, careful. And then there's times where it's irrational. And I think, unfortunately, what a lot of these young people are experiencing are these irrational fears. And they're not being able to find the courage to come and have conversations. And I personally believe that role, if young people are speaking to a therapist, counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, that role lies in their hands. And if we're the ones having conversations with them, that role lies in our hands, reminding them that they play a role, right? Reminding them to take accountability for the courage that they're going to need, right? And encouraging them to find the courage within to have the conversations, right? I would prefer to see counselors and therapists rather than stroking the ego and saying, yeah, you poor thing, you should definitely cut them out of your lives. Not that that's what's happening everywhere, but if that's happening, I believe that the teaching, rather than saying, yes, go ahead and cut them out of your lives, your piece is so important, I believe that we should be teaching them and modeling for them, have a conversation. Go to that person and have a conversation. Maybe ask them why, right? For my children, when they were growing up, I had been attacked and kidnapped while I was pregnant with my younger son, right? So I was experiencing PTSD, I'd been diagnosed. And so some of my decision making was absolutely based in fear. And I tried to make sure that I didn't make all of my decisions based in fear. But there were certain things like my son wanted to play football. Well, I didn't want him getting head injuries, right? And I already had enough fear flowing through my body that I chose to not allow him to play football because I didn't want him getting hurt, right? So just having the opportunity to be able to explain ourselves to our children. If you're the child, I believe whether or not somebody is guiding you through being willing to, grab your courage and go have the hard conversation with the parent. If we're the parent, being willing to say, okay, hold on, let's sit down and have a conversation. What do you want to know? What can I explain to you? Right? What bothered you? What hurt you? What makes you feel like you're so uncomfortable? Right? And then be willing to be transparent and vulnerable with your child. While my kids were growing up, I offered apologies when I knew I was in the wrong. There were times when I would say, I'm so sorry, mom was cranky with everybody. I'm having a hard time. It's not you, it's me, right? And so I think as the adults, as the parent, that we should take ownership for the mistakes that we've made. I can guarantee you that there is not a perfect parent out there. I genuinely tried my best. I intentionally wanted to be the best parent I could be. I put tons of effort into it. And you know what? I made a ton of mistakes. And so there's just not, like, it's not possible to be perfect. It's not possible to be a perfect parent. And I believe that our children of that generation have these expectations that, like, well, you made all these mistakes and you hurt my feelings. It's like, yeah, because I'm a human too, right? So being able to be vulnerable and transparent with our children, I believe, can really help mend some of these confusions, because when we have a lack of communication, we leave so much space for confusion and assumptions. We're going to go ahead and take a break, but when we get back, I want to go ahead and wrap it all up and talk about ways that we can support each other, and talk about ways that we can offer tools for our young people and also tools for ourselves and our friends. So go ahead and stay tuned. I will be back. You're listening to Pure Intuitive Talk. I'm your host, Trish Smith. Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Trish Smith, the host of Pure Intuitive Talk. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to this hour. For me personally, it's been nerve-wracking, which is one of the most important pieces of the information that I wanted to be able to put into your hands today as a listener. I'm going to read this from my notes. Marital researcher John Gottman has found that when our heart rate exceeds 100 beats per minute, effective communication becomes nearly impossible. This triggers fight or flight, impairing the ability to process information. So we need to remain calm as much as possible when communicating. During the break, I was actually talking a little bit about with the producer about just that, right? Like, how many of us have developed our communication skills so well that we're super great communicators and our communication is effective, and how many of us really? Not so many. My personal opinion is that I think it's better to have messy conversations than it is to avoid them entirely. I forgot, I wanted to get back to that whole white people thing. I've noticed, right, in other cultures that they hold on to those bonds, right? They're familial bonds. They've held on to those bonds, and they're willing to have those super messy, communication styles, right? And for me, it's like I look at that and I go, I'd rather have a messy conversation than not have one at all. Whereas I was raised in a family that they would go silent, right? Oftentimes there was times where my mother would excommunicate me for a couple of months. She just wouldn't be talking to me until I had to go to her and say, okay, what is it? What is it? Like, let's talk. And so I don't know how common that particular piece is in white people. But I found it interesting in one of the articles that I read that they were explaining, that it's more common, it seems to be more of an epidemic in the white communities. And I just thought, yeah, I think because in other cultures, they're offering more grace. They're saying like, hey, I'm human. I'm having a hard time. I'm going to tell you about it. And, their loved one is like, well, I don't have to deal with that. You know what I mean? And they're willing to just be messy instead of trying to make everything appear perfect, right? Like, what are we doing? We're doing ourselves this disservice of trying to pretend like our life is perfect and our family is so perfect, and then go get ourselves some Starbucks and our nails did instead of prioritizing our relationship with our family and being willing to have an imperfect conversation, right? So that's just my own perspective, my own personal point of view. Like I said, I don't have an answer for this statistic. I just found it interesting. And of course, I have my theories and my opinions. So there's that. I do believe that we on both sides that we're right, which is one of the reasons I don't hold a political side, right? So I look at politics and I can see where both people are right and where they're not willing to compromise. And I believe that this epidemic that we're experiencing with estranged family members is very similar to that both sides are right, right? And it's finding compromise through intentional conversations, right, is the path to reunification. And so I do believe that the Gen Zers have very valid points, and I do believe the Gen Xers have very valid points. And in my personal opinion, what I'm witnessing is that the punishment is not fitting the crime, right? So you have parents that did their best. A lot of the parents that I see, and I'm kind of picky when it comes to parenting. I'm not gonna lie. That's one of my own faults is that I do tend to like categorize like, oh, it's not good, right? People and their parenting styles. And so, but witnessing who I would consider good parents, right? These are good parents. In my opinion, it's like you've got people that are moms and dads and they're not parenting. And then you've got people that are really good parents. You got amazing parents. You got that mom that you're like, how is she even like this? She's like baking pies from scratch and like sewing her kid's uniform. You're like, are you human? Anyways, but what I'm witnessing is people that I would consider good parents, meaningful people, right, that put intention into their relationship with their child, and they wanted the best for them, and all of those, they did all the things. They're getting cut off. They're being excommunicated, and so I don't feel like the punishment fits the crime there. Now, when it comes to parenting and there's addiction in the family and there's abuse in the family, and as a parent this person was physically, mentally, psychologically abusing the child, or choosing addiction over their children, those kinds of things, I can see it. Okay, kids, I get it. I see why you cut them off, but it's really hard to wrap my head around, why are you cutting them off, until I investigated into my own theories and came up with my best conclusion, is that I believe they are protecting their fears, and they believe that they're protecting their peace, right? So rather than going and having that hard conversation with their parent, they're protecting their fears by avoiding that conversation and then calling it protecting their peace. So that's my theory. I might be right, I might be wrong, but that's my theory. So it does take a lot of courage to have those uncomfortable conversations. What is our role in this, right? We are the elders. Now, I can appreciate it doesn't feel like we are being honored as such in our culture, but the truth is that we are the elders. We need to be able to step back and look at the timeline and know and remind ourselves that if our child is chosen to cut us out of their life, that we still need to remain the individual that is willing to keep that door open and be ready to be the soft place for them to land, right? I spoke earlier about being vulnerable and being willing to be honest about your mistakes and own them, right? But I do feel like, although this feels like very heartbreaking right now, I believe that over time, what we'll witness is an exchange of people being willing to grow, right? And my generation in particular, right? As Gen Xers, recognizing that this coming from these young adults is going to bring value to our relationship in the long run. But right now, it's ugly, it's painful, it's sharp. I see it. My heart breaks for people that their adult children have cut them off. But I just want to encourage you, if you're the parent, to continue reaching out, to continue modeling unconditional love, and begin, if you haven't already, modeling grace and modeling conversation starters. And so that we can guide the young people back to like honoring the familial bond that we would like to see them honoring, right? If they're deciding to cut you out of their lives and you're saying, oh, well, they're just, the problem and, screw them, right? Who's that going to serve? It's not going to serve anybody. And in the long run, it's going to hurt the child more, who's already feeling hurt and they're afraid. And for one reason or another, they're not comfortable coming and having the conversation. And so guess what? As the adult, well, the more adult than those adults, the older, wiser ones, we have to be willing to go and start that hard conversation with them ourselves. And so I just encourage you to have faith and to have hope for the future of your relationship with your adult child, and swallow the pride. I promise you right now, pride has not gotten any of our previous generations anywhere. And so it's time for us as a generation to put that pride aside, own our mistakes, own our role, ask how we can support them, and find the lesson in what their generation is showing us, right? But again, we have to be the ones that model the grace, model the forgiveness. We are the elder. If you have any questions, if you need support, please feel free to reach out. You can contact me through pureintuitiveguide.com. My website has a contact button and you can reach out via email. I work with people over Zoom or in my private practice in my office. So yeah, if you're in those shoes, you need support, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I hope that this message has been able to help you even in some small way. You're listening to Pure Intuitive Talk. I'm Trish Smith. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Pure Intuitive Talk with me, Trish Smith, your Pure Intuitive Guide. Come back and join us for encouragement to take responsibility and to connect to your whole being. Remember that every moment is the right moment to choose peace, acceptance, and forgiveness. We all have the courage to look deep within, get real with ourselves, and make upgrades to our ways of interacting with the world. It's been my privilege to share this hour with you. For more information about me, go to pureintuitiveguide.com. That's pureintuitiveguide.com. Thanks again, and we will see you here next time on Transformation Talk Radio.